Our last speaker is Yuman Lee. She is a conservation scientist with Michigan Natural Features Inventory, and she's going to be talking about adopting an integrated approach to conservation of federally threatened eastern Massasauga rattlesnakes. So we've been talking about EMRs already a little bit, so let's just keep on this roll here.
Thanks, Ellen. And thank you for, and Pierce Cedar Creek for organizing this amazing conference and for inviting me to be part of it. As Ellen mentioned, my name is Yuman Lee, and I'm a conservation scientist and herpetologist with the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, or MNFI, which is Michigan's Natural Heritage Program and a program of Michigan State University Extension. I've been with MNFI since 1997, and I've been studying and working on Eastern Massasauga conservation for over 20 years now. So I'm really excited to share with you today some basic information about Massasaugas and some of the work that MNFI and other partners in Michigan have been doing and to help conserve and recover the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake in Michigan. And we'll also talk a little bit about, some things that you can do to help Massasaugas if you're interested as well. So because MNFI is part of MSU Extension, we just wanted to let everyone know that this talk and all our programs are open to everyone. And so just a little bit of background about the Eastern Massasauga status. And so in history in Michigan and range-wide, so in the early 90s, we started to see some decline and had some concern about Massasaugas and how they're doing in Michigan. And so it was added as a species of special concern in 1992. And then it was protected under the special DNR director's order. And then in 1999, the Eastern Massasauga was listed or identified as a federal candidate, which meant that it warranted listing, federal listing, but that they didn't have the resources at that time to actually list it. And so there it stayed as a federal candidate species until 2016, when the Fish and Wildlife Service finally actually listed it then as federally threatened. And so let's just to talk a little bit about Massasaugas and how to identify them. So they are Michigan's only venomous snake species. I think there are other snakes that look like Massasaugas, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, that are not venomous. But and a lot of people, aren't aware or really surprised to find out that we actually have a venomous snake, a rattlesnake in Michigan. The adults, they're like a small to medium-sized snake. So the adults are on average about 2 to 3 feet long. So they're not very big when compared to other some of the Western rattlesnakes then. And then the young snakes, when they're born, are about 7 to 10 inches long. They have these Massasaugas tend to have these really thick bodies. And so that's one way to identify them. They tend to be very chunky looking snakes then. They also usually have these dark brown blotches on the body and they oftentimes I could describe them as sort of saddle shaped or figure 8 shaped then, but there's a lot of variability in the pattern of the blotches. And then they will have a triangular shaped head because the venom glands are in the back of the head. So they usually have, they're wider at the base of the head compared to the front of the head. And then they also have a stripe that runs along the sides of the face that run all the way to the eye. And of course, as a rattlesnake, they have a rattle at the end of their tail, which is usually a lot of times like yellow color, but sometimes can be black or darker colored. And people have described the rattle as sort of a buzzing sound. Sounds more like an insect or a bee buzzing, a little higher pitch compared to, again, some of the bigger rattlesnakes that you might find or hear out west then. So I mentioned that there are a number of species that look like Eastern Massasaugas. And so, Ellen, do you think you can throw up the poll then here? So we're just going to do a little quiz. So if you if you want to select, just indicate which of these snake species you think is an Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake then. And you can go ahead and close that when, I guess, Ellen, when you think that
I'm going to give people 5, 4, 3, I'm going to count slow, 2, and 1. All right, we're ending that poll and I'll share the results.
Awesome.
Overwhelmingly.
So yeah, that was the right answer. So that's perfect. That's great. So these are the other species in Michigan that that we have that look like rattlesnakes that oftentimes get mistaken for rattlesnakes. The eastern milk snake, the eastern fox snake, the juveniles of gray rat snakes or black rat snakes also have blotching. The eastern hognose snake, and the northern water snake. So, you know, sometimes even when I first see a snake, I stumble upon it, I get excited and think it's a Massasauga, and it turns out to be one of these other species then. And eastern hognose, sometimes you might see it more, like you might be more familiar when it looks like this, where it kind of puffs out and stuff. So anyway, it's just, we're not going to go into details about how, you know, the specifics of how to tell each of these apart, but just wanted to make people aware that, you know, there are other snakes that look like it. So just because it has blotching doesn't necessarily mean it's a rattlesnake.
Someone did mention in the chat, just to let you know, that the non-venomous lookalikes vibrate their tails to mimic rattlers versus the buzz, maybe.
Yeah, a couple of those species like the mill snake and fox snake will do that. They'll vibrate their tail, right? And sometimes if they're in leaf litter, it can make a sound that maybe sounds like, you know, like a rattle, or people might get mistake it for a rattle. Great. So in Michigan, you can find Massasaugas basically through their range is throughout the lower peninsula. So there are no Massasaugas in the upper peninsula of Michigan. But even within Michigan, they're not necessarily evenly distributed throughout the state. They do tend to be a lot of, you know, some concentrations of populations down in southeast and southwest Michigan, and then a little more scattered up in northern Michigan. Oftentimes, you'll find them in sort of these large swamp complexes or along river systems, and then also along the coast, along the shoreline. And then to clarify even further, Massasaugas are associated with wetland habitats. So if you don't have wetlands nearby, or the right kind of wetlands, you're not going to find Massasaugas there. And they'll use a wide variety of wetland habitats. Primarily, they'll use these really open, grassy, kind of sedgy wetlands like prairie fens or wet meadows or sedge meadows. They'll also use some of these tamarack swamp or forested swamp systems, and especially these in southern Michigan. In northern Michigan, they'll also use some, you know, these fens and these shrub thickets that are dominated by alder, a lot of times along streams, and then some of these conifer or deciduous swamp like cedar swamps up north then. So wide variety. General characteristics is that the water is usually up near the surface, or maybe on the surface, but very shallow water, and you know, very open, but also having some cover, shrub or tree cover, to provide shade for the snakes then if it gets too hot. But it needs to be open so that they can thermoregulate, and of course, you know, it needs to have food and all the other things that they need to survive. Massasaugas also, particularly in some populations, not necessarily all, but a lot of the populations will also use upland habitats as well, especially uplands that are adjacent to or near wetlands. And again, they use a wide variety of upland habitats, generally open upland habitats, but also forested uplands. So in southern Michigan, a lot of times these upland habitats that are next to the fens, you know, historically were like oak barrens, or up north, they might be pine barrens. They'll also use some of these forested uplands, like the cedar, some of the pine forests, or aspen then especially up north. And they'll use these upland habitats, particularly gravid females will use them to bask and as they get ready to give birth. And then some of the snakes will also overwinter in these adjacent upland habitats, and they'll also feed and look for prey in these areas as well. And in Michigan, they face a number of threats, just like, you know, across the Massasaugas range. the biggest threat, in Michigan and everywhere is habitat loss and degradation, and also habitat fragmentation. A lot of the wetlands that they rely on and the upland habitats either have been developed, for residential, commercial, agricultural use. Their hydrology might have been disrupted, or other natural ecological processes that keep these open wetlands historically open, like fire or flooding. Some of those processes have been disrupted, which have led then to shrubby or woody or encroachment. And then invasive species have come into these systems as well that have caused them the habitat to be lost or degraded. Inappropriate management or lack of management to help keep these areas open has contributed to some of the habitat loss as well. Roads have been a threat in some areas in terms of causing mortality or presenting a barrier to snake movement so that they can't get, maybe to the other habitats that they need to complete their life cycle. Also, snakes being not everyone's favorite species or animal. There's been, and because they're venomous and concerns for safety, they've been persecuted. Also, there's been some illegal collection of Massasaugas, although we don't really have a good sense of how much that happens in the state. And then, as you heard all about, snake fungal disease is a threat, and also climate change also maybe changing the hydrology and causing some issues for the snake in the future as well. So you can see lots of different threats facing the snake. So trying to address all these things to try to help manage and conserve them is really challenging. And you heard a little bit already about, why are snakes important? And so similarly, for Massasaugas, again, the ecosystem services are important to maintain for ecosystem health. Again, you've heard about controlling prey populations and providing food for predators. And when we protect habitat for Massasaugas, and especially because they use both wetlands and uplands, we're providing habitat for a number of different animal and plant species. You've heard about the human health aspects in terms of controlling disease. One thing I wanted to mention that snake venom, not just for Massasaugas, for other rattlesnakes though, have been used to develop medicines to address some human issues like heart attacks or blood clotting or brain injuries, brain conditions. And then, they're an important part of Michigan's natural heritage, just like the other wildlife species that we have. And so, and I think they're gorgeous, and obviously I'm biased, but one of my favorite species. And as it turns out, Michigan is at the center of the Massasaugas range. And historically and currently, we have more populations of eastern Massasauga rattlesnakes than any other state or province in the species range. And so what happens to Massasaugas and the conservation recovery of Massasaugas in Michigan is really important to help recover and protect the species range-wide. And so in terms of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has drafted a Massasauga recovery plan to try to help guide what we need to do, what we'll need to do to try to achieve recovery of the species. And the vision for that is that we need to have sufficient number and distribution of healthy populations of Massasaugas across the species range to help ensure that long-term viability, to also maintain evolutionary drivers such as gene flow and genetic diversity and natural selection, and have enough and healthy populations in order to be able to withstand and recover and adapt to changes in the environment, and also to withstand and or to guard against catastrophic events that might wipe out significant portions of the species or the species as a whole then. But we have these remaining, that sounds great, but we have these questions that, what constitutes a healthy population that's viable for the long term? And what are those characteristics exactly? What constitutes sufficient number and distribution of populations? And what would this look like on the landscape? And how many healthy populations do we need? And how much habitat would we need to protect and maintain to achieve this? And how are we going to assess and monitor this over time? And so we're in the process of trying to figure out the answers to these questions and what we need to do to achieve Massasauga recovery. fortunately, in Michigan, and when I say we, I mean collectively, all the partners in Michigan, we've been working on Eastern Massasauga conservation and recovery for many years now, basically for the last 25 to 30 years. We've, worked on doing surveys and monitoring. We've done a lot of research on this species, especially since the species was listed as a federal candidate. Also, we've done a lot of work on trying to protect and manage and restore habitat, or at least we're making some progress on that. We've done some education and outreach, and then also developed some, plans for how to try to best conserve the species. And so, I'm not going to talk about all these things that, but I'll highlight some things that we've been working on and moving into the future. So, one of the first things if we're going to try to, reach that recovery of the species and is having a better handle on, where do we have populations? How many populations do we have in the state then? And so we've done a lot of work on that to try to figure that out over the last, 25, 30 years or so. MNFI conducted a status assessment of the species in the mid 90s. And basically that, included compiling reports of the species from the general public and from other researchers and professionals, looking at museum records and getting information from those, and then also conducting some field surveys then, as well as field surveys by other researchers. And this map kind of shows then, it's a little dated, but it just gives you a sense, again, that map that we looked at before of the distribution of the snake in Michigan. And right now we've been, so we've been continuing to do that work, since then. And right now in the Natural Heritage Database, there are almost 300 element occurrences of Massasaugas. And so you can see we have a lot of populations then, or a lot of occurrences of the species. They're not all doing great though, and so a lot of these populations are either historical or extirpated potentially, or we don't have a lot of information about them to know, how they're doing then, if they are viable or not, and a lot of them are facing threats then that cause them to be vulnerable. One thing that I think is really exciting that we're starting to move into that might help us in the future be able to continue to assess and monitor their status and distribution of populations and look at trends across the state over time is looking at occupancy and trying to incorporate modeling occupancy and detection probability. And so Erin Thacker, who's a master's student with Dr. Jennifer Moore at Grand Valley State University, just completed her master's last year. And she did work on looking at trying to use occupancy modeling and detection probability to try to estimate occupancy for a subset of sites that she visited. She visited, I think, about 30 or so sites, and about a third of those estimated occupancy probability, about a third, 30, so I think we can use that. So that's a low number then. So there's definitely concerns there, but I think we can maybe use this method in the future to try to monitor the species status. Another thing that we've done then is to take a look at the element occurrences, the information that we have in the database, so we know where species have been documented. And you can see that in this figure here, these red circles, hopefully you can see them, are locations where Massasaugas have been documented. And one thing we wanted to look at was, are these populations really isolated, or are they potentially connected by habitat? And that maybe there's snakes that occur between them, we just haven't documented them. And that maybe these are not like isolated populations, but they're connected populations potentially, or that may have functioned in the future, in the past, I mean, as as one large population historically. And so we did some analysis looking at the element occurrences, looking at land cover data, looking at rivers, streams, and lakes, and then kind of giving each of those different habitat types a score in terms of how easy it would be for Massasaugas to move through them, how suitable would they be for Massasaugas or not suitable, and then looking at barriers, and then trying to see if we can, delineate some populations that we have in Michigan. And so the green that you see is where we have suitable habitat, where snakes could potentially use them to move from one area to the next. And And so using that analysis, then we looked at the element occurrences. And so you could see here these different, the pink polygons and the yellow, the brown, those are where we had element occurrences where snakes have been found. And then the green outline then shows where what we have delineated to be a population, where it may function, as one big population, potentially historically, and maybe currently still do as well.
Man, here's your
Yep.
4-minute warning.
All right, thanks.
Yep.
And then if you overlay roads, you can and the stream systems on there, then you could identify potentially places where we could maybe do some additional survey work, or places maybe where we can do some management to try to facilitate that connectivity then between these sites. So we identified almost 200 populations then using that analysis. Over about 110 of them we estimated, looking at available information that they may have excellent, good, or fair viability or potential to be viable. And then from those, we ended up identifying 43 priority or focal populations in the state that we could really try to distribute throughout the state. That if we really worked on making sure that we can try to maintain and protect these populations, then there would be a good chance that we could recover the species and sustain the species in Michigan in perpetuity. But these population delineations and viability need to be evaluated. And so we have done some work with, again, Dr. Moore and Eric McCluskey at Grand Valley State University, looking at doing a landscape connectivity, landscape genetic study to try to see if some of those populations that we delineated, if there's evidence that there is some gene flow or some between them, and also where there may be issues where there's barriers or some issues where we could try to help facilitate connectivity again. Another really exciting area that we've been doing in the last 10 years or so, and starting to do more of, is this. We've always struggled with, given how cryptic and hard it is to find Massasaugas, being able to actually monitor them and come up with size of populations and information on population survival or demographics, which is information we really need to be able to really manage these populations. And so in the last 10 years or so, they've started to do some of these mark recapture long-term population monitoring studies. There's been a couple sites in Southwest Michigan that have been monitoring populations there for over 10 years now. And then we're starting similar efforts at additional populations in the northern lower and also in southern Michigan as well. And what we found that it seems to work pretty well is to do these kind of blitz style, where you try to get as many people out there as possible during 1 week. And you just try to find as many snakes as you can during that 1 week early in the spring when the snakes have just emerged or soon after emergence. And then you mark them, and then you'd repeat that survey, year after year during that same week then. And that those studies have been able to produce some population estimates using that approach. And then coupling that with trying to assess and look at the impacts of habitat management at these sites then as well. We've also, I mentioned earlier that there has been some habitat management restoration work done in Michigan, and especially trying to maintain open habitat, where there's been some study, again, Erin Thacker with Grand Valley took a look at that with the occupancy modeling that she did. And one of the variables that came out to be really significant was canopy cover, tree and shrub cover, and making sure that, trying to keep that below 50%. So that's really going to help us, guide us with future work, and maintaining hydrology, making sure that you maintain the suitable habitat for all the life stages, and then trying to maintain connectivity between habitats and populations. And then we've also done a lot of education and outreach in the past. We've developed some materials. There are a number of websites that provide information about Massasaugas. We've done training workshops for the general public and for natural resource professionals as well. There are some videos. And we have found that, with the training workshops, the materials that we developed in the past, we were able to impact and increase knowledge and interest, and at least some positive feelings toward Massasaugas but we still weren't able to really reduce the fear level then. So, but I think, we can make a difference here in helping people better understand the snake and hopefully, be more tolerant of them. And we had this, one thing really excited about is we had this new project that's just starting up where we're going to try to integrate all these different components. And so bringing them all together, we've done these different conservation activities, but they haven't always been all together at the same population, the same sites. And so we're going to be able to try to do that as part of this new project, and hoping that this will maybe provide a model for future work. So really excited about that. And then finally, just some, suggestions if you're interested in doing some things to help Massasaugas, learn about, Massasaugas like you're doing today and other snakes in your area, and share your knowledge. You can go out and look for, and if you see Massasaugas, make sure to report them so you can help us, again, track the species status and distribution in the state. There are a number you can report to MNFI or the DNR or the Herp Atlas. And then you can actually get involved in Massasauga conservation and research. Like I mentioned, some of those population surveys are looking for, look for volunteers to help out. So you can maybe help with that, or help with habitat management activities. And if you own property that has Massasaugas or habitat for the species, you could help maintain and restore habitat as well. But I would suggest that you definitely work with a local conservation partner and contact the Fish and Wildlife Service and the DNR then, since you need permits to do that. So, and that's it.
That was a lot of great information, and you already answered some of the questions that came in, so that's wonderful. Okay. One of the questions that did come in is, what overwintering sites are you seeing? Water shrews, crayfish, other mammal burrows, and what ground and water temps are you seeing the emergence of, are you seeing for emergence in the spring? So
yeah,
it's kind of two questions there, but.
Okay. So for the overwintering sites in southern Michigan, a lot of times they're using crayfish burrows, sometimes maybe small mammal burrows then. Up in northern Michigan, a lot of those sites, it's more like in cedar swamp areas. And so it's more like tree root networks or hummocks, and not as much. I mean, some places will use burrows, but then other places they're just, it doesn't look like they're using burrows then. And for temperature, it's some of the studies that have looked at Massasauga emergence, they find that snakes emerge when there's a flip. So when the the temperature of the lower soil profile ends up, when the upper soil profile ends up being warmer than the lower, when there's a switch in the spring, then that's when the snakes emerge. So I don't know that there's an actual temperature, at least that I can recall, but it's more that inversion when that happens then.
Awesome. Nate asks, are there any links between the EMR habitat restoration efforts in Michigan and ridding or decrease of the snake fungal disease that Ellen was talking about? Are there any success stories or tips for EMR habitat restoration efforts?
Related to snake fungal disease?
Well, one is related to snake fungal disease, it sounds like, but in general, are there any success stories or tips for habitat restoration for EMR?
Yeah, I mean, the real key is like maintaining those open habitat conditions then. And so there've been so we know that, I mean, we know what looks like, what appears to be good Massasauga habitat. What we haven't been able to do, because we haven't really done those long-term studies, is really monitor and demonstrate that the snakes are really responding. There has been some work done at one site in Southeast Michigan where the area was like just totally covered and super, dense with glossy buckthorn. And now they've cleared it and opened it back up. And we're finding lots of Massasaugas there, but it's hard to, I think that is, probably a response to, that is improved habitat because of that. But we don't necessarily have the pre-data to compare, after, to say for sure that, to demonstrate that impact then. But, it's got to be related to that work. And for snake fungal disease, we just don't know enough about, the impact on Massasauga populations. It does seem like whenever we test it, we find it, but we're not finding it at very high levels, in terms of a percent of snakes that test positive for it, or There's been some evidence that some snakes have actually maybe been able to look better from, when we first see it, and then if we catch it again a couple years later, they actually look better. So it's hard to tell. We don't really have enough information at this point.
Awesome. I know we have more questions, but we have run out of time.